Owl Creek Bridge is one of the best stories written by Ambrose Bierce, and it was written during the period of 1842 till 1914, and is actually a story with a historical background. So you cannot study this story without knowing the historical background of it. And it says here, it is the account on the Confederate sympathizer sentenced to death by the Union forces. Now the story begins with the prisoner standing on a railroad bridge, hands bound and noose tightly. Before we start, you need to know that the story is divided into 3 parts. It's very important to follow the timeline of the story in order to understand it well. Now in part one, there is a scene of a man standing upon a railroad bridge in Alabama, looking down into the water, and this man's position is showing that he's going to be executed on this bridge. As you can see here from the description given, and it's a vivid description, the man's hands were behind his back, then the rope closely encircled his neck, is attached to what, and we have here 2 private soldiers attending the situation. We're having a sergeant, we're having another sentence to show that he was a captain, and then we're having the whole situation described in those 2 paragraphs. A man is going to be prepared on a railroad bridge, prepared for an execution. As I told you, if you read those 2 paragraphs, you will notice the vivid description of the words, how his hands were tied, how he looked, a description of the people, the 2 soldiers and the sergeant who are attending or preparing him for the execution. And then also further explanation of the man who was 35 years old. He was a civilian, so he was not a military person. He was much of a planter. I am highlighting all the important words that will help you understand the story. And then I give a description of his features. He wore a mustache, how he looked, his nose, his forehead, and a lot of descriptive words to show how he looked. Then also the preparation here was being completed. He's prepared for the execution by the soldiers and the sergeant. And then they're waiting for the sign of the execution, in which one of the soldiers is going to raise his foot of the log, and then he's going to be hanged or executed. Now we see the man here closing his eyes in that scene, and in order to fix his last thoughts upon his wife and children. This sentence is so important. It highlights the theme of near-death experience, and how would people think of memories or people just before they die. So we know that this person knows that he's going to be executed soon. He is closing his eyes to keep the memory of his wife and his children in his mind. And then we have description of the water under the bridge. We know now what is the man thinking of? And we're introduced that by diving I could evade the bullets, and swimming and then reach the bank, and this is what was happening inside his mind, and this is what we call stream of consciousness. So here we have the author or the narrator telling us how this man would think of the situation. So we know that he was planning to escape this execution. Till the last lines we have here as these thoughts, which have here to be set down in words, the thoughts of escaping, were flashed into the doomed man's brain rather than involved from it. The captain nodded to the sergeant, and the sergeant stepped aside. And this is the end of part 1. We know so far that the end of part 1 is about the sergeant raising his foot from the log that's holding the man. Then we're introduced to part 2, which is mainly a flashback, taking us to the past of this moment. And we're introduced with the name of the main character that we have seen in the first part. Peyton Farquhar was a well-to-do planter and an old and highly respected Alabama family. We know that he was a slave owner. And also we know that, like other slave owners, a politician. So one more time, we're introduced to the circumstances of nature and the historical background of this period of time. Mind something, that if we look into the historical background, you would find that this happened, or this story is set to happen during the Civil War between the northern states and the southern states. And the Civil War was mainly concerning the idea of slavery. And then in the flashback, we know that one evening, we see Farquhar and his wife were sitting on a bench near the entrance of their house. And then we know that there is somebody asking for water to drink. Mrs. Farquhar was only too happy to serve him with her own white hands. Remember the use of the word white hands and the idea of serving. Okay? Back then, only black people used to serve. One more time, we're speaking here about the historical background of this story. While she was fetching the water, her husband approached the dusty horseman and inquired for news from the front. So he's asking him about the news. And what was the answer? The Yanks are repairing the railroads. So he's telling Peyton Farquhar that the railroad, or the opposite side, are repairing the railroads in order to be ready for another advance. They have reached the Owl Creek Bridge, put it in order, and built a stockade on the north bank. And then we know that there is a note posted everywhere declaring that any civilian caught interfering with the railroad or the bridge, what would happen to him? Would be hanged. Now in this story, it's not mentioned it's not mentioned clearly which side was Peyton Farquhar with, but we can tell that he had the idea of preventing those who rebuilt the bridge and the railroad, and he had the idea of preventing them from coming to his place. Then he asked, how far is the Owl Creek Bridge? And then there is no force there. He had known this from the man. And then he had this idea, and we can tell that this is the reason behind the execution. Suppose a man, a civilian, and a student of hanging should do what? Should have the idea of ruining this bridge. What could he accomplish? And then the soldier reflected, I was there a month ago, he replied, I observed the flood of last winter had lodged a great quantity of driftwood against the wooden, and it's now dry and would burn like tinder. And then we have the word burn here playing as a foreshadowing word to tell us what might happen before. So now we know that there is an idea of what? There is an idea of stopping this event from happening. An idea of destroying the railroad and the bridge. Okay? Maybe by burning. The lady gave him the water and he left. And we are here with this word. He was a federal scout. Pay attention to what the author is trying to tell us. Sometimes you as a reader know something that the characters in the story do not know. And this should work as a way to attract your attention. Now we're here back to part 3. So part 1 were the scene of the execution. We're introduced to the man, and we know the setting and what was happening there. Then we move to part 2, which was the flashback. We know what happened previously, which is the meeting of the scout and the main character here, and the idea of burning the bridge or the railroad. In part 3, we are back to the situation of the execution. And then we know that here, Peyton Farquhar strayed downward through the bridge and lost consciousness and was as one already dead. So we would understand that Peyton Farquhar fell into the water. In the coming paragraphs, maybe 3 paragraphs, we have full description here of how he felt, how he or his ideas. So we know how he felt. Where did he feel the pain? Full description of the body parts, his body parts, his for example, hands, how he felt, and because of falling into the water. Then we have the ideas that were happening into his mind. We also not know that he was going through the woods or the forest. We're introduced to full description of the forest. He was even able to hear the sounds of the insects. The description is vivid. If you read it, you will feel that you are inside this scene. And then we know here that he had came to the surface facing down the stream. We know that he was heading to his house. See, even the words dived and dived as deeply as he could. And then the water roared. Description of the 5 senses. He's tackling the 5 senses. What can you hear? What can you see? What can you smell? How did he feel? A whole scene here with even the officer and the soldiers trying to shoot the man who fell into the water. Then we go here by nightfall, when he was at last, finally, thinking of his wife and children, he was able to do what? He was able to meet them. And then we have here another description here, the wood on either side description, and then back to the pain, back to the description. And then despite his suffering, after all the description of the suffering that we have met here, he had fallen asleep while walking, for now he sees another scene. Perhaps he has merely recovered from the illusion that he had, and he stands at the gate of his own home. This sentence is very important. He stands at the gate of his own home. And we know that he is home, and that his wife had opened the door, and then see how beautiful she is, and then so on. And then after living all this situation and being in the images, we are shocked with the end of the story. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body with a broken neck swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. We know that all the description that we have read here was all maybe happening in his mind, and that the reality is that he was hanged there in the first scene. Now, that's why this story is one of the best stories, especially during that period of time. There are many devices used here to attract the audience attention. As I told you, vivid description was clearly and repeatedly used in this story. And we have here the twisted plot, or the twisted ending. At the end, you have something unexpected to happen, which is actually ironical. Then we have many themes here discussed through this story. We have the theme of death, near death experience. What would we think of before we die? What about ideas? Also the power of the mind. And this technique was called is called stream of consciousness, when the reader knows what was happening inside the main character's mind through the narrator or the story.